note the pattern here. I'm going to flip through pretty quick. We go to 1844. Blue, Democrat, Polk beats Clay, mustard or gold, right? Whig. Okay. 48, which is the end of time period 4. We're going to just, again, think about the tick here, okay? Blue, Democrat, mustard, gold, Whig. Okay. 52, again, wow, dominate, right? Democrat dominate with Pierce. Scott wins a couple, not a whole lot. Now all of a sudden we've got some territories popping up here. Oh, look at that. The addition of Texas, which was in the last one too, but still. Now, notice the pattern here. Democrats are blue, Republicans are red. 1860. President Lincoln, right? Popular guys from Illinois. Red. Republicans. Green. Southern Democrats. Okay, we get some other Northern Democrats, which is Missouri, and then you get your Constitutional Union, Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. But what you see here is there's no pattern between 1840 and 1852. But in 1856, a pattern starts to emerge. In 1860, the pattern manifests itself. What you see here is before, nobody really talks or cares about slavery all that much. Everyone's benefiting. But this growth of the ideology of anti-slavery movement, the tick has gotten much larger. To the point in 1860 where it's obvious the North and the South and the issues we have between slavery and how it becomes an issue in our country. I'm going to pass it off to my right-hand man, the myth.
Mr. Welch, I don't think I was red enough. I think I need to add some more red.
Well, I'll tell you what, this guy makes red look good. That's all I know.
Red's the best color.
Yeehaw.
Alright, well I'm back with my adventures with the Avengers. As you can see, Doctor Strange, he hung his cape, so I took over. Whatever, Captain America, he's alright. Iron Man, cool guy. But, like our Western friend here, Mr. Welch, talked about, slavery. And he said, as he demonstrated, the change of politics between these two states. He took a larger scope in discussing how politics have changed. Now I'm going to lead you in more of a narrow scope, talking about explicit examples of resistance to slavery. We're going to see a common thread between abolitionists and the American Revolution, as you guys saw from time period 3. Before these big leaders like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, took up the helm of leading the revolution against Britain, we saw a lot of grassroots movements within the colonies. Same thing with resistance to slavery. We see a lot of grassroots resistance. Individual slaves themselves not wanting to be slaves. Wow, I'm getting whipped for not working hard enough. I'm not getting paid. My wife and children are separated from me. Yeah, I think all of you would be pretty upset being a slave as well. John C. Calhoun, smart guy, but terrible opinion. I think some of you might laugh out loud when you hear Calhoun's argument about how life as a slave is awesome. Not so much, Calhoun. First, covert resistance. Covert could be, in a sense, a synonym would be secret. Not as obvious resistance. Slaves, ever since the beginning of slavery in the United States, there have been documentations of slaves doing things such as sabotage. You can see in the picture, cotton gin. You may have a slave that breaks the machine that slows down production. Working slow. Purposely in the field, these large plantations. Yes, you have overseers that are tracking your work, but an overseer can only see so much. Working slow in the field. Taking your time picking up the cotton. Maybe like some of our football players, taking their time getting to drills. Yeah, we know what you guys are doing. Resistance to football. We're on you. I'm not going to name names. But, also, pretending to be confused. Okay? Oh, master, I don't know how to pick this tobacco. I've never farmed tobacco before. So, we see that slaves pretend to be confused and hence slowing down their production of their slave masters. You may be asking yourself, well, Mr. O'Donnell, what's the impact of this? Did this really end slavery? The direct answer is no. These things did not directly end slavery. But think about the snowflake analogy. When you have a roof, a ton of snow over top of it, and it just takes a few more snowflakes to collapse that roof. Okay, the little things matter. In history, sometimes we tend to focus on big man history. Big man history, like the Don, like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass. Those are big men in history. But we also have to acknowledge that little things do matter. These little snowflakes do pile up and eventually do lead to the overthrow of slavery. Also, I have a quick video for you. If you have not seen this movie, this is called 12 Years a Slave. Maybe saying to yourself, Mr. O'Donnell, how is worship a part of resistance? Now, I want you to watch this video. While you're watching it, I want you to think about the purpose of this song. Why are they singing? Where are they? It has a lot of hidden messages that we're going to talk about in a second.
Where John baptized 3, where I walked the devil in hell, said Johnny baptized me. I said, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for the year Jordan roll. Well, some say John was a Baptist, some say John was a Jew, but I say John was a preacher, cause my Bible says so too. I say, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll. Hallelujah, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll. Hallelujah, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll. Everybody say, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll. Roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll. Roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll.
Some great stuff there. If you're curious, that's from the movie 12 Years a Slave. Won a lot of awards. Marvel Studios, you know what, their budget, they give us a lot of money. So if you cannot hear that video, we are going to post it in the classroom so you can watch it later. If you cannot hear it, pause the video, go watch that clip, and then come right back. Okay? So, what is the big point of this? Why am I showing this video? Worship was very important, not only to slaves and thinking about their souls, thinking about their religion, thinking about their salvation and their beliefs. It was also a form of resistance. A quick backstory about this song. This is an actual song that was sung by slaves, Roll, Jordan, Roll. And it was introduced to slaves early on, late 1700s, when a preacher wanted to give the message of salvation to the slaves. And he said, hey, how am I going to preach this message of being saved to a group of people who cannot read and write? And he was very intelligent in the fact that, hey, they can sing, they can speak. So, when slavery first started, you had a lot of these leaders during the Great Awakening, and they wanted to reach everyone, including slaves. They taught them songs. How does this relate to the video and the setting of this moment? Hopefully you saw a bunch of crosses. In this part of the video, one of their friends died. So they actually had a funeral, and they're singing this song. If you caught on to some of the lyrics, they talk about his soul being risen up. So they want, hope that his soul reaches heaven. Again, the point of salvation. And they mention John Baptist in the song as well. So the original intent of the song was to teach slaves about the message of salvation. But decades go on. Slaves transform the song. Not less of the words themselves, but more of the message. The song Roll, Jordan, Roll was actually a secret message to slaves that it was time to leave. It was time to escape the plantation. And that is going to lead me into my next topic. Before I get to that, you want to mention one last thing. Slave masters, they preferred using stories in the Bible that preached obedience, that preached happiness, to be humble in your situation, clearly because they had an agenda. Like Mr. Welch said. They wanted to prove that slavery showed that, the Bible proved that slavery was okay. Also be humble in your situations. Be happy with what you have. Clearly, the slave masters have an intent when using religion and teaching their slaves. On the flip side, slaves preferred stories that talked about heroes. For example, David versus Goliath. You could say the slaves themselves represent David and they're up against this big Goliath, aka the plantation system. Also, they love stories of Exodus. Exodus, think about Moses leading his people out of Egypt. Speaking of Moses, next unit we're going to talk about Harriet Tubman, who helps numerous slaves escape, who eventually gets the name Moses. Speaking of escaping, I have a source for you to read. Please read along as I re-speak the words of Jason Taper from 1840. He says, "I now take the opportunity to inform you all that I am in the land of liberty, in good health. I have paid $50 in rent this year. Next year I expect to build." He's referring to his own house. "The Queen of England has granted 50 acres of land to every colored man who will accept of the gift and become an actual settler." This is a very great encouragement to those who have come here for the liberty which God has designated for them. "Since I have been in the Queen's dominions, I have been well contented. Man is as God intended. He should be. That is all born free and equal." Sounds familiar? This is a wholesome law, not like the southern laws, which puts man-made in the image of God, on the level with brutes, or you could say animals. Very powerful quote. You may need some context to understand what is going on. John Taper, he's writing this in Canada. He's referring to Queen Victoria of England, which was still in control of Canada. Ironic, where he talks about the land of the free and equal under British rule. So maybe we're seeing hypocrisy here, which we've talked about before. Ideologies during the American Revolution. All men are created equal. This man is speaking about being created equal in Canada, which in effect is under British rule. Also, why I underline this word encouragement. He's writing his letter back home in America, trying to reach other slaves in the South. He's encouraging them to escape. It is estimated that about 1,000 slaves a year escape the South to go to the North. Eventually, we're going to talk about in the next unit why a lot of slaves eventually had to go to Canada. Our next key concept, 4.1, 2D, 3A, 3B. Enslaved blacks and free African Americans created communities and strategies to protect their dignity and family structures as they joined political efforts aimed at changing their status. Like I said, what we just talked about were very grassroots movements, individuals taking matters into their own hands. Now we're going to see actual organizations of not only African Americans, but other white Americans that are attempting to end slavery. Again, organizational resistance to slavery. Nat Turner Rebellion. Nat Turner is an interesting person. I'm going to show you a quote in a little bit. He was a former slave who initiated the largest slave rebellion in American history. What he did, he got several of slaves from the plantation that he was living in Southampton, Virginia, and he started a riot. He killed the plantation family in Southampton. Went to the next plantation, did the same thing. Got a bigger follower of slaves. Did the same thing in the next plantation. So maybe you're seeing his plan. He's physically trying to end slavery by killing the masters and their families, going from plantation to plantation, getting more followers. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you feel about this, Nat Turner is killed, and his rebellion is stopped. Along the way, he killed 60 men, women, and children. Very devastating. But what I want to direct your attention is that Nat Turner had a lot of repercussions. Repercussions were this. Number one, rebellions did not work. You can probably see the aftermath of this rebellion. If you're associated with Nat Turner, you're most definitely punished physically, almost to the point of death. Besides that, this made plantation owners in the South very, very worried. Okay, even if you're 2 states away in Mississippi, you might be saying to yourself, wow, my slaves might do the same thing. My freshmen, we have talked about this topic, took us 2 days. And I asked the kids, I said, if you were a slave owner, what would you do if this happened? A couple of girls were like, I would set them free. I'd be nice to my slaves. And then this gentleman in the back, one of my wrestlers, not the nicest guy, he goes, Mr. O'Donnell, I'm going to beat them, I'm going to whip them, make sure this never happens again. He literally said, I'm going to put the fear in God in them. And I'm like, holy cow, you're exactly right. Sorry, ladies, being nice is not something you want to do if you're in the slavery business. So, repercussions. Slaves, masters did not allow their slaves to read after this. This became a larger law. Their punishments, a lot more physical, more whippings. Besides just whipping the actual person. If Mr. Welch and I were a slave, okay, let's just pretend we're friends for a second. Good friends, or family members. If I escaped and they couldn't find me, instead of killing me, they're going to kill Mr. Welch. Which stopped a lot of people from having rebellions in the first place. Also, they were not allowed to organize themselves. As you saw in the last video, with those slaves at a funeral, those things stopped happening. And here's why. Here's a quote from Nat Turner. Nat Turner is not a normal slave. You may be saying to yourself, why didn't every slave do this? You're going to see why. He says, my mother and others said I surely would be a prophet. Prophet is someone who's a middleman between the people and God. As the Lord had shown me things that had happened before my birth. And my father and mother said I was intended for some great purpose, aka to end slavery. My grandmother, who was very religious, my master, who belonged to the church, and other religious persons noticed my unique manners and my uncommon intelligence, and remarked that I would never be of any service to anyone as a slave. Nat Turner was a very smart slave. Not just for a slave, but for any person. He was very intelligent. This worried slave masters. Like I said, going back to religion. Okay? They couldn't form their own churches anymore. They understood that Nat Turner used religion as a lightning rod to get supporters, to actually kill the plantation owners. So all of these organizations came to a halt. Until we come to the north. That was in the south. Along the same time, in the 1830s, we have something called the American Colonization Society. This was founded by Reverend, who was a Presbyterian, Robert Finley. He advocated the recolonization of slaves to Africa through gradual emancipation. He did not want to freak out people in the South. He didn't say, hey, let's free all the slaves. He said, hey, there are a lot or a decent amount of slaves free here in the North. He's writing in the North. He says, hey, these people in the North, there's still some racism up here. They may be taking jobs. He says, you know what, as they become free, let's ship them off back to Africa. Gradual emancipation. As they become free, whether they buy their freedom or eventually the South ends slavery. They thought it wouldn't be lasting forever. Then Finley wanted to send them back to Africa. Finley had other supporters, our friend Henry Clay, the perennial loser, and another son of a founding father, Benjamin Rush. He believed that they both thought this would help blacks and whites. Again, think about some common themes that we have today with people that we do not appreciate being in our country. So think about jobs. Okay, someone like Henry Clay would say, well, this supports other whites because when they become free, they would eventually take your job. So let's relocate them to Africa. Plus, we have a lot of social tensions between blacks and whites. Back then, they did not like blacks and whites being married. Shocker. Okay, Henry Clay says we solved that by sending them home. Moving one step forward. Another organization. This man, Benjamin Lundy, started a newspaper. This is italicized for a reason. Infamous newspaper called Genius of Universal Emancipation. If you're not sure what the word emancipation is, talk about the freedom of slaves. Universal, everywhere. Free all the slaves. This is a newspaper in Baltimore in the 1830s. His ideas were very similar to Finland. Whereas slavery would end eventually, let's send them back to Africa. So maybe say to yourself, Mr. O'Donnell, why do you bring this up? I bring this up because of this very important individual called William Lloyd Garrison. You're going to read about him in your next assignment. He had his beginnings in this newspaper. And he said, this is not going far enough. We need to go further. So our last thing of the day, a very important organization, going back to that concept map, and an organization that is resisting slavery. Something called the Anti-Slavery Society, founded by that person, Garrison, in 1833. Instead of having slaves gradually become free, because he's saying, hey, slavery is not ending anytime soon. If we let the course take its toll, slavery might not end for 100 years. And you might not have been wrong if we continue the way it was. So he said, slaves should be free immediately. Crazy idea, radical. If you're a southern plantation owner, you're like, let's find this guy, let's tie bricks to his feet and throw him at the bottom of the ocean. Okay? Crazy idea. Free all the slaves. What? Not only that, something else that's very important. He incorporated former slaves like Frederick Douglass and other activists such as Susan B. Anthony into his organization. These people met once a year to talk about strategies how to end slavery. Now, why is it important that someone like Frederick Douglass is incorporated? Because he's a former slave. If you're someone in the North who has never experienced slavery, maybe has never even seen an African American before, then all of a sudden Frederick Douglass, very well spoken, very intelligent, it gets in front of the audience and talks about the horrors of slavery, you can convince a lot of people why slavery is bad in the North. Also at the same time, you got to think about hypocrisy. Again, this idea of freedom to people like minorities and of different gender. Susan B. Anthony, we're going to come back next unit, or further units, because she comes back into a different couple ones. She advocates women's rights. So again, if we talk about equality for everybody, William Lloyd Garrison says we need support of women because they're equal as well. Okay? Now, to wrap all this up, like Mr. Welch and I said, your textbook does not talk a lot about slavery because they put a lot of it into the next units, which is leading up to the Civil War. But these issues are always apparent going back to 1820. So, like we mentioned earlier, this is a very important election. Election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln won. Civil War almost immediately followed. Again, going back to the big man history thing. Hey, associate Abe Lincoln freeing the slaves. This and the Republican Party, which was founded on abolitionist movements, did not start with a few people. It started with covert resistance. It started with William Lloyd Garrison. People actually talking about these things. Nat Turner, people rebelling. All of these ideas started in this time period, and that is why we have felt the need to talk in this in great detail. So, Mr. Welch, it's been a lot.
It's a lot of stuff. Hopefully you're still entertained. I know my outfit's outstanding. Our guy lost his cape. Too much red, I guess. The camera said no, so the cape fell off. So we said you had to respond to something, so this is what you're going to respond to. I'm going to give you a little context here, okay? Pretty competitive, him and me, if you haven't figured it out yet. Just a little bit, okay? One of our hobbies that we share, only a few that we share, he has red hair, I obviously have magnificent non-red hair, is that we like to golf. So fall break, we decide we're going to go golfing. And we have a tendency to, sometimes we like to place wagers on who's going to win. I always win, because I'm the best. No, I'm not, but you get it, okay? And what usually happens is after 9 holes, Mr. O'Donnell will have a lead, maybe by 1 stroke, 5 strokes, 7 strokes.
Shot an eagle.
You know, maybe he'll shoot an eagle on the front 9. He'll be feeling good about himself. What Mr. O'Donnell's quickly learned is that you don't like to talk smack to Mr. Welch. I actually perform better when you do that. I get angry. When I get angry, I focus. I'm not always focused, if you guys hadn't figured that out yet. So yesterday we're playing golf at Fire Lake. I'm not going to give any specific scores because they weren't that good. They were horrible. We're playing golf, us two, Mr. Lopez. Great time. Mr. O'Donnell at the turn, which is after 9 holes, after an eagle on 9, drove the green, outstanding job, Mr. O'Donnell, props to you, is beating me by 7 strokes. 7. He's not saying anything, he knows not to poke the tire, because I might swipe my paw. I'm upset. You know, cue Drake, I'm upset, okay? We go into the back 9, and I tell him, wow, Mr. O'Donnell, you're beating by 7 strokes, that's a lot. He knows not to say anything. Go into hole 18, we're tied. After hole 18, the champ, the best, won by 2. So here's your question. Did Mr. O'Donnell blow it? Or did Mr. Welch, like any true champion, found a way to win it? Is he Mr. 3-1? Am I the guy wearing the belt? What's the difference here? I know this.
Till next time, folks, Mr. Welch.
3-1! 3-1 lead! Ah!